Everyone knows the Marshall Plan rebuilt Europe after World War II. What they don't know is who really paid for it and why. The accepted story goes like this. America, flush with post-war prosperity, generously poured $13 billion into Western Europe between 1948 and 1952. Factories rose from rubble. Trains ran again, democracy took root, the end. Except that's not what happened at all. The money was real. The rebuilding was real. But the motive, that's where the story splits in half. Start with the stated reason. Secretary of State George Marshall stood at Harvard in June 1947 and announced that Europe was dying. Starvation. Unemployment running 30% in some cities. Entire regions unable to feed themselves. He wasn't wrong. Post-war Europe was a charred wound. Britain, France, Belgium, industrial powerhouses 6 years earlier were now bankrupt and begging. The humanitarian case was genuine, but here's where most histories stop reading the room. Nobody in Washington was simply being generous. Look at the incentives instead. Europe wasn't just poor, it was becoming communist. Soviet influence was spreading like oil across a puddle. France and Italy had massive communist parties. Germany was split. The math was stark: feed Europe or watch it turn red. So the Marshall Plan wasn't charity, it was containment dressed in a suit. America was essentially paying to keep Europe capitalist and aligned with the West. The cost of not doing it: Soviet satellites across the continent. The cost of doing it: $13 billion, which in 1948 dollars meant real money. About 5% of the entire U.S. federal budget year after year. But here's where the story flips. This wasn't just geopolitics theater. The Marshall Plan actually worked, and it worked in a way that benefited American business in ways Marshall himself probably didn't fully articulate. The money came with strings. European nations had to buy American goods, machinery, raw materials, food. Suddenly, American factories that had ramped up for war had a new customer base. Think about the timing. The war ended in 1945. By 1946, American manufacturers were panicking. What happens to a war economy when the war stops? Demand collapses, unemployment rises. The Depression had only ended because of military spending. Now that spending was gone, the Marshall Plan solved that problem elegantly. It created a captive market for American goods under the guise of humanitarian aid. Europe received the money, yes, but roughly 80% of it was spent on American exports. European nations couldn't use Marshall dollars to trade with each other. They had to buy from the United States. It was brilliant, economically and politically. America got to play savior while simultaneously reviving its own industrial base and locking Western Europe into economic dependence on American goods. The real genius was that it wasn't corrupt or secret, it was transparent. Congress debated it, the press covered it, but the mechanism itself, tying aid to the purchase of American goods, was just economics. No bribery required, just incentive alignment. European governments got the dollars they needed to stabilize their economies. American companies got markets. The US government got allies. Everybody moved. And it worked. European economies didn't just recover, they boomed. Industrial production doubled in many countries by 1951. Unemployment dropped. Trade resumed. Democracy took root not because Americans were altruistic, but because prosperity is the best antidote to extremism. Poor, desperate people vote communist. Employed, fed people with savings accounts don't. But the Cold War economics didn't stop there. As Europe stabilized, it became a bulwark against Soviet expansion. NATO formed in 1949. Western Europe remained capitalist, democratic, and crucially dependent on American military protection and American trade. The Marshall Plan created the conditions for decades of American geopolitical dominance. So what's the real explanation? The Marshall Plan wasn't one thing, it was three things operating simultaneously. First, genuine humanitarian relief for a devastated continent. Second, Cold War containment strategy to prevent Soviet expansion. Third, and this is the part textbooks gloss over, a carefully structured economic program that revived American manufacturing and locked Western Europe into economic dependence on the United States. All three motives were real. None of them contradicted the others. That's why the Marshall Plan endured as policy and why it's remembered fondly even now. It solved multiple problems at once. Starving Europeans got food, American workers got jobs, the US government got allies, the Soviet Union got contained. The logic was so clean that it actually worked. The implications ripple forward. The Marshall Plan became the template for how America would deploy power in the post-war era. Soft power through economic aid, military presence to back it up, trade relationships that benefit both sides but anchor the weaker partner to the stronger one. It's not colonialism, but it's not pure altruism either. It's something more durable, aligned interests. And it shaped the world we live in now. Western Europe remained capitalist, democratic, and prosperous. The Soviet sphere stagnated. That gap, prosperity versus stagnation, is a large part of why the Cold War eventually ended the way it did. The Marshall Plan didn't just rebuild Europe. It made the case for capitalism and democracy in a way that propaganda never could. It made them profitable. That's the real story. Not a simple tale of American generosity. Not a cynical tale of American manipulation. but a more complex reality where good intentions, strategic necessity, and economic self-interest all aligned perfectly. The Marshall Plan worked because it was designed to work for everyone involved, which is why it's one of the few large-scale government programs that's hard to argue against, even now. Understanding the Marshall Plan means understanding how power actually works at the geopolitical level. It's not about who's good or bad. It's about who has leverage, what they need, and how to structure deals so that incentives align. That's the real lesson. That's what shaped the post-war world and continues to shape international relations today. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research. Subscribe so you don't miss the next breakdown of how economics and geopolitics actually intersect, the stories textbooks leave out. This video is for educational and informational purposes only and is not financial advice. Always do your own research.